November. That's when elections are going to take place. In Israel, it depends. In theory, a government is elected for 4 years, but it never lasts more than 2 to 3 years because of all the internal machinations, and one party suddenly withdraws from the coalition. They no longer have 61 seats, so they have to announce early elections. And from the moment the elections are announced until the new government is sworn in, not until the elections, until the new government is sworn in, a period of anything of 4, 5, and even more months can pass. And during that period, the Israeli government actually is a bit of a dead duck because it doesn't take any very major policy decisions during that period. So today, even though we're well over a month after the elections, the actual government that is running the country is still the outgoing government because the new government yet is still being negotiated between all the different parties and hasn't yet been sworn in. Once he gets his 61 together, they sign coalition agreements, which have now at least have to be made public. In the past, they could be kept secret. So you never know what promises were made to different parties in terms of special budgetary allocations for schools, for culture, for other sort of things. And now at least there's a law which insists that all of these have to be made public and out on the table. So we can all be critical of the agreements that were reached until that's been done, and then Netanyahu has to swear in his government in the Knesset. It has to go for a vote. At least 61 people have got to raise their hand to say they support the government, and then the new government is officially sworn in. In Israel as well, there's one other little thing that happens, and that is that the president has a major role to play in the formation of a new government, because immediately the elections have been finished, over the next week, representatives of every party who have achieved seats in the Knesset go for a meeting with the president of the state. The president asks them who they are going to support, and on the basis of his understanding who has the best ability to put a 61 government together, he will then, by constitution, invite that political leader. He will give him a month to put the coalition government together. And if he doesn't achieve it in a month, I think he gets another 2 weeks or something. We're rapidly approaching that period. It's never happened that after that period, well, it has happened once, that they haven't been able to put the government together. But then if after 6 or 7 weeks they can't do it, he can then call upon someone else or even announce there needs to be new elections. In most cases, it will be the leader of the largest party who at the end of the day is invited to put the government, who is invited to put the coalition together. But in theory, and it has happened on 1 or 2 occasions, the president has used his power to invite not the leader of the largest party, because it could be the leader of the largest party, let's say for theory's sake, is on the right wing, and he's managed to get all the right-wing votes together, and there aren't any other right-wing parties. By the way, in Israel there are plenty of right-wing parties. Whereas, let's say on the left, the leader of the Labour Party may have got less seats than the leader of the Likud party, but he has a lot of satellite parties who are prepared to support him, but are not prepared to support the other leader. And if for whatever reason the president believes that the guy maybe with the second largest number of seats has a better capability of putting it together, he will do so. There was a case where I think it was Shimon Peres, who of course until recently was the president of the country, but when he was the leader of the Labour Party, was actually approached to put a government together, even though he wasn't the leader of the largest party. And at the time, there was great criticism of the president, Chaim Herzog, because he himself had come from the Labour Party. What's interesting at the moment is, of course, that the new president of Israel is a guy called Rivlin. He was the Speaker of the Knesset in the past. He's very much part of the right-wing party of Netanyahu. But Netanyahu did everything to prevent him from being elected president. So there were great fears within the Likud party that Rivlin would take his revenge on Netanyahu and ask the other guy to form the government. But at the end of the day, the result was so clearly in the favor of Netanyahu, there was no way that that could happen. And actually, in the eyes of all the analysts, Netanyahu has a much greater chance of putting the government together than the other one. But as I say, that creates a very unstable form of government. You never know how long the government is going to last. and it's very likely that within 2 or 3 years it's going to come crumbling down. So we have elections every sort of 3 years on average, as opposed to every 4 or 5 years. And there's always been great demand for electoral reform, not because it favours the right or favours the left, but because we believe that we waste a huge amount of time and resources in supporting unstable governments. We need greater stability. To have greater stability, you need a different system. And one of the ways which is creating slightly greater stability is by gradually raising the minimum electoral quotient every time. And there are those who say we should raise it. We've raised it from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3. There are some who say we should raise it to 5 or 6%. And then at least we'd end up with, say, just 5 or 6 parties, all of which would be significant, and a coalition government would only have to, say, make up of 3 or 4 parties and not 7 or 8 parties. When you have 7 or 8 parties, you have to promise everybody a number of seats around the cabinet table. Now, they may all be right-wing parties supporting Netanyahu's right-wing policies, but you've got within those right-wing parties those who have a religious agenda and those who have a secular agenda, those who have a social agenda and those who have another agenda. So they also have differences within them, between themselves, and you can imagine it's quite a jigsaw to pull together. Netanyahu or any leader has to put together a professional team of negotiators who can sort of bring everybody in line and tell everyone what they can get and what they will have to give up on. And it's not easy, as you can see from following the current news. They haven't been able to put the government together yet. Now, why does Israel have that system? And here I come to the second part of my discussion about looking at the issues and the history of Israel itself. That was all a bit technical, but I think it's important to understand. There are 2 reasons why Israel has the electoral system it has. One is because, first of all, when the country was established, this coming week is Independence Day, when the country was established almost 70 years ago, 67 years ago, it didn't have any clear idea as to what the electoral system would be. And basically, it adopted the existing system of the Zionist organization, which had been pushing for the establishment of a state and which had different factions within it. It basically adopted the system that existed at the time because it didn't have a great deal of time to think too much about what will be the constitutional electoral system we'll go for. It's very interesting that in the first 10 years of statehood, there was a political leader in Israel who was the first prime minister by the name of David Ben Gurion, after whom my university in the Negev is called. It's called after Ben Gurion because Ben Gurion's grave is in the desert in the south of the country, where the university is located. Ben Gurion, who was the most powerful political leader that Israel has ever had in history and was the longest serving prime minister, it's very interesting that he was the only one in his party that wanted to change the electoral system. But his party, the Labour Party, who were in power for the first 30 years of statehood without any change, didn't want that to happen because they realized they were political animals. And they realized that any change in the system would weaken their own hegemony, their own power to win election after election. And when eventually power did change for the first time in Israel in 1977, and the new Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, of the right-wing party came into power, he came into power through an understanding of how to use the existing electoral system. So the right wing as well have never been over keen to change the system. Remember, to change an electoral system, it normally means that you're going to change the way politics is done. That means that you're going to change the nature of the people who are the candidates and the members of the parliament. And yet the people who have to vote a new system into law are exactly those politicians sitting in the Knesset who benefit from the existing system. It's never been suggested to put it out to franchise to, let's say, a group of judges and professors. They can be advisors, but it's never been suggested that they should take the decisions onto what the new system will be. That will always be a political decision, and it's the politicians who benefit from the existing system who don't want to change it for their own personal political reasons and so on. But I think it's also important to say that even if you were to change the Israeli electoral system to make it a more stable system, you would never want to change it from one extreme to the other. You wouldn't want to bring it right over to the other end so it becomes an American or a British style system. And actually most electoral systems in the world are neither the Israeli type and are neither the British or the American type. Most electoral systems in the world have a mixture of proportional representation within constituencies. They have constituencies. Increasingly in electoral systems in Western Europe, most of the post-Soviet states have what we call a mixed electoral system, whereby some people are voted from regions, some people are voted from national lists, and also within the regions, it tends to be a proportional system rather than a single member constituency. And so you have a balancing effect, whereas larger parties get more seats from the constituencies and smaller parties will probably get more seats topping up from the national list. And it reflects greater proportionality, but it also gives a greater degree of stability than you have in the Israeli system. Now, the Israeli system, of course, reflects many different groups within Israeli society. When we talk about right wing and left wing in Israel, we don't normally refer to what the rest of the world means in terms of right and left wing, in terms of social policy, government intervention as opposed to laissez-faire economies. What we normally mean when we talk about right-left politics in Israel, we are usually talking about the Arab-Israel conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict. Are you prepared to withdraw from the territories and create two states for two peoples? That's the left-wing position. Do you believe withdrawing from the territories is dangerous? Do you promote settlement policy in the West Bank? That is the right-wing position. I'm saying this in a very simplistic fashion, of course. There are variations on that. That is what right and left is normally defined as. And that is normally what the key issue on elections are. So if you were watching the lead up to the Israeli election, you'll see that Netanyahu didn't make any major declarations about housing policy or economic policy. He said a lot about security policy. He came, as you well know, caused a major fracas both here and within Israel by being invited by the leader of the House, the Republican, to address the House when it was against the wishes of President Obama. So, of course, that's caused tremendous tensions between Israel and America, between Obama and between Netanyahu, within the Jewish community in America, those who supported this position, those who didn't support this position. But the big issue of right and left wing in Israel is about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Interestingly enough, it has played a smaller part in the recent elections in Israel than you would probably think, because most Israelis don't feel there is anywhere to go at the moment on the peace process, even those who oppose Netanyahu's policies. And what's happened in the last few years, it has been a major growth of social discourse, of economic discourse. There's been a bit of a social rebellion amongst middle class, many of the students who feel that they're not getting into the housing market. And so there's been a certain shift towards economic and social policy. And in fact, Netanyahu's one of his major coalition partners in the new government is most likely to be a member who split from the Likud a year ago over Netanyahu's social policy. A guy called Kahalon created his own party for the elections, got quite a number of seats, 12 or 13, and is now going to be the major coalition partner, but he's made the condition that he will be the economics minister. That's his condition for joining the government, a very finance minister, very powerful, like Secretary of the Treasury, because he wants to change social policy. And he didn't talk at all about the right wing, left wing on the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's another big issue which has come up, and that is, of course, 20% of Israel's population are Arab/Palestinian. Now, they have traditionally run in a number of very small fragmented parties, which is what the old system always allows you to do, to divide over what your difference is rather than to unite over what unites you. By pushing up the minimum threshold to 3.2%, the smaller Arab parties realized that if each one continued to run alone, there was a danger that they would all miss out on being in the Knesset. Some people even argued that the right-wing reason for raising the threshold was to ensure that the Arabs wouldn't be in the Knesset. But surprise, surprise, they got their act together, And for the first time in Israel's history, they formed a single party and have ended up being the third largest party to be represented in the next Knesset. It's the same number of seats they would have had as four separate parties, but as four separate parties, it's possible that none of them would have got into the Knesset. As a single large party, they're very well represented. Now, they're not going to be part of the coalition government. They've never been part of any coalition governments in Israel, even the left-of-centre governments, who have always sort of garnered their support from the outside rather than have them sitting around the cabinet table, which is a major problem in terms of our understanding of democracy within Israel. But had Herzog been elected, had the Labour Party leader been elected, he would have had to really deal with the issue, because there is no way that he could really turn around to the third largest party who are on his side of the political spectrum and say, well, you know, as long as there's a conflict, we can't really trust the Arab parties to be part of the negotiations over peace, and therefore we want your support, but you need to remain outside government. That would have been almost impossible for Herzog to have done had he won the election and had he put the coalition together, given the fact they are now the third largest party in the Knesset. But there's no question that that has consolidated their power by pushing up the lower threshold, and it remains to be seen in the Knesset to what extent they will continue to act together as a united party, or they'll start to fragment over the ideological schisms and issues which divide them. As you're well aware, in Israel there are other sectoral groups. The religious parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, have major numbers of seats, and in those parties, it can often be a single leading rabbinical figure who determines how tens of thousands of people will vote. In other words, they don't make up their own mind. They belong to particular Orthodox parties where they take their political leadership from the religious leaders, and these religious figures, these senior, very ultra-Orthodox rabbis, determine who they should be voting for, which party, and they therefore carry very great political power. In the last, traditionally the religious parties have gone in with the right-wing governments. In the last government they were frozen out for the first time ever, but now it's very clear they're going to be part of the Netanyahu coalition, so they're back in power, and they're going to determine their own sectoral interests, which is getting allocations for their separate schooling system and for various religious legislation. And in addition to the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox and the religious parties as such, there has been another group who have been very influential in Israeli elections, and they are, of course, the Russian parties, because in the 1990s, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, almost 1 million people from the post-Soviet states immigrated to Israel, and in the first 10 or 15 years, they formed their own Russian parties. Avigdor Lieberman, who's a very right-wing political personality, at the moment the foreign minister of Israel, originally came from Russia. The Speaker of the Knesset, I've forgotten his name for the moment, but the Speaker of the Knesset, who's just been re-elected as Speaker, was a Russian refusnik who came in the 70s. And in the first years, the famous prisoner Anatoly Sharansky, who's now no longer in politics,